A Guten Erev Shabbos. Here's a classic from the archive. Don't stop me, even though you've heard this one before. After months of negotiation with the authorities, a Talmud scholar from Odessa was granted permission to visit Moscow. He got on the train and found an empty seat. At the next stop, a young man got on and sat next to him. The scholar looked at the young man and thought, this fellow doesn't look like a peasant. And if he is not a peasant, he probably comes from this district. If he comes from this district, he must be Jewish, because this is a Jewish district, after all. On the other hand, if he's a Jew, where could he possibly be going? I'm the only Jew in our district who has permission to travel to Moscow. But outside Moscow, just outside Moscow, there's a little village called Samvet, and Jews do not need special permission to go there. But why would he be going to Samvet? He's probably going to visit one of the Jewish families who are there. But how many Jewish families are there already in Samvet? Only two, Bernsteins and Steinbergs. Couldn't be Bernsteins. A nice-looking fellow like him must be on his way to visit the Steinbergs. But why? What's he going for? The Steinbergs have daughters, so maybe he's their son-in-law. But if he is, which one? Which daughter did he marry? They say that Sarah married a nice lawyer from Budapest, and Esther married a businessman from Zhytomyr, so it must be Sarah's husband, which means his name is Alexander Cohen, if I'm not mistaken. But if he comes from Budapest, with all that anti-Semitism they have there, he must have changed his name. But what's the Hungarian equivalent of Cohen? Kovacs. But if they allowed him to change his name, he must have some special status. What could that be? He must be a doctor or a lawyer. Either way, he has a doctorate from the university. So at this point, the Talmud scholar turns to the young man and says, "How do you do, Dr. Kovacs?" Man says, "Very well, thank you, sir," a little bit startled. "But how is it that you know my name?" "Oh," replied the Talmudist, "it was obvious." So what does this story, and dozens of others like it, tell us? It tells us about what's in a name. Everything, and sometimes nothing. The idea of name changes is a fascinating one in Jewish life. This is one that my father told me about our family name change. Our ancestor, who came from Lithuania to the U.S. in the 1880s, had the name, apparently, Chaim Berman. Arriving in the Golden Medina, he sought to change his name to something a little less Jewish, as was the custom in those days. Chaim obviously became Hyman. That was the easy part. But what to choose for an American surname? As he stood there pondering his future, a beer truck happened to roll down the street on its way from the Kanofsky Beer Brewery. He thought, that must be a fine American name, and he took it as his own, and 5 generations later, here we are. So again, it begs the question of what names tell us about people. Surnames, as describing professions, dates back to at least the Norman conquest in the English-speaking world. So you have Coopers, and you have Millers, and Weavers. In German, you have the same thing. A Metzger is a butcher, a Schaefer is a shepherd, a Schubert, shoemakers, and so on. I'm sure other languages have similar things. Jewish last names didn't exist until at least the Middle Ages or even later, or they were given in hindsight, in retrospect. They sort of made a patronymic out of the father's name. Moshe ben Maimon became Maimonides. Moshe ben Nachman became Nachmanides, and so on and so forth. Tribal affiliations became one kind of surname. Cohen, Kahan, Kahanovich, Kogan, Kagan, Kaplan, Kovac, Levi, Levi, Lawi, and so on. Under this heading of tribes are also the harder to figure out abbreviations or contractions. Segal, Segal, Sagan LeKohen. Katz, an abbreviation for Kohen Tzedek. And Azulai, a common name amongst Sephardic Jews, a Rashi Tevis for Isha Zona Lo Yikachu, a verse from Leviticus chapter 21, verse 7, that Kohanim may not marry women of suspect morality. Speaking of Kohanim, Rappaport. It's a well-known family of Kohanim. originating with Meshulam Yekutil HaKohen Rappa, who was from the town of Porto Mantovano in Lombardy. So Rappa plus Porto became Rappaporto. The Gaon of Vilna, who was a firstborn, had this custom where he used to redeem himself with 5 silver coins each time he met a Kohen, because it's hard to be 100% sure that Kohanim are Kohanim, even with the name Kohen. He never felt confident that he had been redeemed to an actual bona fide Kohen 100%, so just to be on the safe side, the Gaon made a little pidyon ben for himself, with 5 rubles or something, with each Kohen he would meet. This continued until he met someone named Rappaport, at which point he stopped the practice, because Rappaports are so widely and well known to be Kohanim. Finally, he was certain that he was redeemed according to the strictest letter of the law. This story was told to me by someone named Rappaport, who of course is not a Kohen. Many Jewish surnames also come from professions. Asayag, Sayer is a goldsmith in Arabic. Gabay, for people who are Gabayim, you won't be surprised to hear. Elbaz, Baz is a falcon in Arabic. Atali, from the Arabic word for porter. Shochet is a shochet. Kaufman is a merchant. Wechsler is a money changer. Maler is a moel. We could write a book just on names that come from trees. Birnbaum is a pear tree. Nussbaum, a nut tree. Applebaum, Grossbaum, Kleinbaum. Eichenbaum is an oak. Kestenbaum is a chestnut. Weidebaum is a willow. Mandelbaum is an almond. And of course, Tannenbaum is a Christmas tree or a pine. Later on, the institution of toponyms, or names based on geographic places, set in. So we have whole clans of Berliners, Breslauers, Krakauers, Posners, of which Pevsner is a variant, Litwak, Vilner, Ostrover, Sax or Sax for Jews from Saxony, from Sachsen, not to mention Deutsches, Franks, Frankels, Hildesheimers, Oppenheims, Salzburgers. In France, Trèves became Dreyfus, so they say. I think in the local dialect it also means crooked feet. I can usually be fairly civil when the situation calls for it, but with Israelis with Israeli surnames, my veneer of politeness slips sometimes. I feel driven to start any conversation by guessing what their name used to be before their grandparents or parents changed it. I can guess the easy ones. I asked Ya'ari if his father might have been called Valder, and I figured Har Evan was probably Steinberg once upon a time. The more obvious ones are just translation. Adler became Nesher, Ochs became Shur, Silverman became Kaspi, Hertz became Levavi, Zinger became Zamir. Here's some you might recall from the olden days. Let's see if you remember them, back to those days. Shkolnik became, can't hear you, Eshkol, also Lamdan. Feld became, what do you say? Sadeh. Lempel, Lapid. Kleinbush, Sneh. Or just more Hebrew sounding, not even a direct translation. Berkovitz became Barak. Neumann, Ne'eman. Torchiner became Tor Sinai. Neumann became Ne'eman. Ben Gurion. Green became Ben Gurion. Shimshalevich became Ben Tzvi. Rubashav, Shazar. Goronchik became Goren. Berlin became Bar Ilan. And Aubrey Solomon became more famous as Abba Ibn. And of course, Milakovsky became Netanyahu. I think it's fascinating that a big part of becoming Israeli in the early years of the state anyway had to do with changing your name, taking on a new identity. And the same was true on this side of the Atlantic. I came across a book in the Toronto Library titled A Rosenberg by Any Other Name. A professor from Michigan State researched legal name changes in the New York City courts in the first half of the 20th century. And of course, the vast majority of them, statistically speaking, were Jews changing their names to much more American-sounding first and last names. We have this myth that it was the immigration officer at the point of landing who changed the name from Katzenellenbogen to Kent because it was easier for him to spell. Or the famous one you know about the Jewish immigrant who was supposed to tell them his new English name, but he couldn't remember it. So he said, "Ach, hab schon vergessen." And they wrote him down as Sean Ferguson. Delightful stories, all of them, but they never happened. says the author of Rosenberg, for the simple reason that passengers' names on arrival had to match with the ship's manifests. Otherwise, they would have been classified as stowaways and sent back to wherever they came from at the steamer company's expense. But we tell ourselves these stories to ease our consciences, knowing full well that in fact it was we who changed our own names in order to fit in better. So then, all that by way of introduction just strengthens the question. If the majority of Jews in today's world changed their names at some point in the last 50 or 100 years, so what is in a name, after all? That's a question we ask this week because God changes both Avram and Sarai's names in this week's Parsha, along with the promise that their destinies will depend on it. Avram became Avraham, with the addition of a hey, as it's written, because you will become Av Hamon Goyim, the father of many nations, not just the Hebrews who will become the Jews, but many nations who will look to you for inspiration and guidance in belief in monotheism, which we see has become quite popular around the world in one form or another. There's also a name change for Sarai. Sarai is a possessive form, suggesting that maybe her distinction up to that point was being the wife of Avram. She becomes Sarah, a name associated with royalty, because her influence is going to reach far beyond her tent, far beyond her immediate family. Now, God is God. God can do anything. Why was it necessary to change their names? What difference does it make? One possibility is that the very letters of a Hebrew name convey spiritual meaning and power, even divine life force. We recognize this when we change someone's name. For example, adding a name when, God forbid, a person is ill. Adding a name changes the combination of divine life force that sustains the person, changes their identity even. Midrash Rabbah says that Avram understood that as Avram, he would not beget, as they say, physically father children. That would not preclude him from being a spiritual father to believers in one God, but God changed his spiritual composition by changing his name, and he fathered first Ishmael and then Isaac, Yitzchak. So what was it about the name change that had an actual, tangible effect? From another angle, the Radak comments that others saw him in a different light with his new name. Not only that, they spread the word about him. So his reputation was altered as a result of his name change. So we have several factors in the mix. We have the reality of an actual change in the spiritual composition of a person. We have the person's self-perception. How do they look at themselves? How do they feel with a different name? And we have their reputation. How do others look upon us? So which one is it? Maybe it's all three. And maybe they interrelate one with another. The way we feel about ourselves affects how others perceive us. Our confidence and sense of purpose is perceptible. People pick up on it. And the other way too, when others trust us and look up to us, we have more confidence in ourselves. And all that is affected by our spiritual makeup, which may change over time. And what we do may itself have an effect on our very spiritual and emotional state of being. So in short, all of us, including Avram, who became Avraham, Sarai, who became Sarah, and in a few weeks, stay tuned, Yaakov, who becomes Yisrael, and all of us who are constantly becoming Yisrael, and all the things that we're becoming. We are all onto something. As it turns out, there is a lot in a name. Shabbat Shalom.